Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the podcast. It's episode 234. It's been a little bit of a hiatus here. We've missed a few weeks of the podcast, but we're back. And today we've got a great conversation with my friend Will Hutcherson, all about helping kids and students feel seen. We've had Will on the podcast before to talk about this topic. I've had Will talk to parents in our church about this. I mean, it's incredibly crucial to help kids and students feel seen, for kids that are battling anxiety, depression, despair, having thoughts about suicide. And in this conversation, we talk about the new book that he and Dr. Chinwé have written, and we talk about how this could apply to us personally, how it could apply to our family and friends, and how it can apply to leaders that we lead in churches, and how we can help them cultivate connection among kids and students. You can get all the links and show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 234. We'll have links there for the book, and like we'll talk about in the interview, about where you can get it if you want, getting it just for yourself versus if you want to get a collection of the books, maybe for leaders or parents in your church, you're probably going to want to use a different source. So we talk about that at the end. I'll recap it in the outro, but let's jump into this conversation with Will Hutcherson about helping kids and students feel seen. Well, today I'm talking with my friend Will Hutcherson, who's been on the podcast multiple times. How you doing, Will?
Hey, Nick. Good to be back.
Yeah, give us like an update about, and maybe an intro for somebody who's listening for the first time, about you and what's going on for anybody that's listened before, but, just kind of catch us up on how things are going.
Yeah, so I've been a youth pastor, next gen pastor for the last 15 years. And about 3 years ago, kind of a pastor turned mental health advocate, started a nonprofit, started working with churches and schools on issues of mental health. And, I like to joke, Nick, that years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, we pastors, we preached, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? and now it's more about mental health. Mental health is the issue, and we just need more resources. We need more conversations, and we need to help parents specifically with how to navigate some of these mental health issues that they're facing with their kids. So started Curate Hope 3 years ago, and just been an incredible ride as we've just continued to partner with churches and schools to empower parents to provide hope.
And I'm so excited because now we're talking about your new book, Seen, and I feel like I've gotten to watch that get developed. We've had conversations on this podcast about it. You've talked to parents in my church about it, but I'm just excited because now it's a book that is complete and is going to be more accessible by more leaders and parents to help with their kids and students. So tell us about the book that you and Dr. Chinwé authored, is when it's coming out, and we're going to dive into a little bit of what you talk about in the book.
Yeah, that's good. I and this as a communicator, like you put something together, and I remember the first time I put together an outline for parents. Specifically, it was for a school. School asked me to come in and do a parent workshop, and so I put together this outline based off of some psychology and some research I was diving into of how our brains are wired and how do we, kind of use attachment and understand attachment to really connect with the heart of a kid or a teenager. And that first outline became kind of this foundation of some of these concepts of teaching really practical ways to connect with the heart of a kid or a teenager. And so over the last few years, I've taught it, in various places, including this podcast or, on the webinar with your parents. Doing the book process has caused us to even simplify it even more, honestly. It is so simple. Like we made it where it was easy for the average dad or the average mom to be able to pick it up and read it in 2 hours and feel like there's hope for their kid when they're facing anxiety and despair and depression. Because oftentimes, and we know this as pastors, like oftentimes either we feel powerless or stuck when it comes to these issues, or certainly parents do, right? It's scary to watch your kid go through something really dark and challenging. And at times, parents are looking at their kids and they just seem so emotionless, or they feel numb. They feel so detached from their emotions. And that can be so heartbreaking to watch. And oftentimes parents feel powerless. So this tool, this book, as a way to empower parents to let them know that, hey, this isn't the only thing. This is a wraparound approach. We need counselors still. We need spiritual tools. We need prayer. We need scripture. We need all of the things that we have. But now we have some connection tools that can also encourage healing, specifically in the ways that God has wired our brains.
That's awesome. And I got to see like the framework before, and when you taught it with parents at our church, it was so helpful. And you say you simplified it more, and you have in the book, but I thought it was pretty simple to begin with. So I just love, even though it's kind of a different framework, it's still getting at the same core important things, right? And I just love how handy it is. In fact, so we can talk about like what's in the book and kind of the framework and how this can help parents and anybody. But I use some of the things that I've learned from you with my own kids now, and they're still pretty young, 8, 5, and 2. But the idea of being seen and connection and eye contact and appropriate physical touch and just emotional exhale, that phrase used sometimes kids and teenagers, they need to emotionally exhale. I use that all the time. I mean, this week, my older 2 are at camp, and 2 days ago, so it was this day 4, 2 days ago, our older daughter, the 5-year-old, she had a nervous first day. I dropped her off. She's very anxious, right? My son, it's his 3rd year. He was like ready to go, and my nephew is in the same group as him. So like he's fine. Well, but our daughter, I knew she was really anxious. She did well and I left. Well, the end of like that day, so the first day, I guess, my wife's bringing her home. She said she kind of lost it in the car over something simple, like couldn't take her shoe off. And I said, that makes sense because she had to emotionally exhale, she's only 5. Yeah. This isn't quite to the things we're talking about in the book, but like that same principle, is there. And even the next day. And then even actually it was last night. So that's the 3rd day. She kind of cried and just let a bunch out talking to my wife upstairs randomly, and I just come back to this right here. Like, is she being seen enough? And in our world where Jennifer and I are on Zoom calls all day, so we're home, but we're not with her as much, right? Like there's this sense of like she feels even less seen probably. I just think about all that. So I'm just, giving away some stuff here before you talk about it. But my point is, even with my kids' age, I'm already applying some of these tools. So I'm excited about some of the additional things that are in this book. But let's talk about what's in there. Well, actually, let's start here. I know we've done this before. Nobody likes this part. But let's talk about why this matters so much and how much has changed in mental health in teens in just 10, 15 years. Tell me a little bit about that. I know some of it's in the book.
Yeah, well, we've already had a mental health crisis. And if you work with kids or teenagers, that's not a surprise to you. But 2020, kind of exasperated it, right? It made it even worse. So we've gone through a year where perhaps none of us have felt seen in many ways, right? I think about even our little group of next gen pastors, that we hang out, we're good friends. And it's like, man, it's been 18 months or more since I've seen some of my friends that I would typically see on a regular basis. Yep. And so 2020 was a year of not being seen. And in some ways it was a year of like being almost too seen. So if like you're a parent and you got a kid that you were home with all the time, you're like, no, I saw my kid too much,
Yeah.
But the reality is that all of us, that there was this mentality of surviving that we have to just own and recognize. And it feels like, well, that was a year ago. I'm not there anymore. But sometimes the effects of events like 2020 can have ripple effects in our wiring and how our brains are wired. You think about this prolonged months, and some people are still in that kind of survival mode, but it is months and months of feeling this fear and loss, right? We felt fear for our health. We felt fear for our safety. For some in our culture, there was this fear of action being taken against us because of our ethnicity or the color of our skin. Those are real fears, like real things that people were carrying in 2020. Fear of lost future plans, or rather the loss of that, the grieving of loss, the loss of security, and in some cases, really grieving even the loss of loved ones, right? So, you think about that, like 2020 was just such a survival mindset for all of us. And if you can think back to you as an adult and how stressed you felt and all the anxiousness you felt, now take all of that anxiety and pressure and put that into a mind that's already coping with high anxiety, despair, and depression. i.e. the mind of a developing teenager or young person, right? And so prior to 2020, we already had a mental health crisis where teenagers were trying to navigate through these really high complexities. And then we add an additional crisis that kind of exasperates the issue. And so the need right now is a need to be seen more than ever before. And I'll give you a few quick stats. Suicide rates have increased 76% in ages 15 to 19. And specifically in 2019, the highest rate of suicide among all age groups was actually in the 10 to 14 years old age range.
It's just
right. So this isn't just a teenager problem. This isn't just a middle school, high school problem, or even young adult problem. Like this is really starting to see where we're starting to see 6-year-olds who are having, suicide ideation, or 8-year-olds even that are saying things. I was talking to a counselor earlier this week that talked about a 6-year-old who's struggling with suicide ideation. I mean, that's so young. And the way that our culture is kind of set up right now, and kind of just some of the circumstantial things that are taking place, it's really not helping young developing minds to feel seen and to feel safe. And chances are, if you're a parent listening, you have a preteen or teenager or young adult in your life, or if you're, a youth pastor, a kids pastor, chances are, a kid who is either themselves struggling with anxiety, depression, or despair, or, they're only one step removed from a friend who's really struggling with those things. And the hard thing about this is, as parents and as caring adults, like, it can feel like there's nothing we can do. I know some parents that they're just afraid of getting blindsided, one day just hearing about, something that their kid did or cutting or whatever the case may be. And it can feel so helpless. Like, we feel so helpless against all of this. But the good news is that there is really powerful tools that we can use, and they're not hard to apply, that actually influence our psychology and our natural wiring to increase hope, decrease despair, and decrease anxiety in powerful ways. And it just so happens to be that through connection, through feeling seen, when somebody feels love and empathy, when adults help them to emotionally exhale, as you just said, like, there's all these little kind of ways that this applies. But when a kid feels seen, despair decreases. And it is just a natural byproduct of how God wired our brains to respond to connection in powerful ways.
And I know we've talked about some of these before, and there's kind of a different framework in which you talk about the tools in this book. But give us a few of those handles. Like I mentioned early on, I'm always going to remember your points about eye contact and appropriate physical contact, appropriate physical touch, and being completely heard. And because again, it goes back to this. I've used this. I was talking with somebody else, an adult recently, and struggling with some anxiety and depression, and I can't help but as I'm listening, I hear that you're not feeling seen enough. And they're, as an adult who's very understanding of what they're feeling and how they're thinking and what is true, but their body's telling them something else. You know what I mean? Their mind is telling something else. So even they could understand that's part of what's going on, even if, and that's where it gets hard, right? In reality, they could be seen in many ways a lot, but then still somehow you don't quite feel it. And that's that harsh reality that as a parent or leader, it isn't all on us. I mean, on one hand, that's okay because that helps with guilt when things do not go well. On the other hand, it's hard because you want to just fix it, right? But give us some of the things we can do. We know they're not magic buttons, but what are some of the handles?
Well, first let me say this about, when a kid is struggling with despair or depression, not every negative emotion is depression, by the way. One of the things that we're kind of seeing right now in our culture is that there's a lot of like negative emotions that you experience for a short time, and we label them quickly as depression. And I would say, limit the labels specifically, leave the labels, either labeling yourself or labeling a kid or a teenager. I would really strongly encourage adults not to label. Leave that to the professionals. When I talk to my friends who do have clinical depression, diagnosed clinical depression. And some of them, are on medicine. They've been on medicine for years, and that medicine really helps them. It helps them to kind of decrease some of the chemical imbalances that are taking place. And it gives them a space to do some thought processing work that keeps them in a place of hope. But of my friends that I've talked to, who, and some of them, like I said, are very close friends, they would say that it's kind of a wraparound approach to managing their depression, that the medicine is a part of that, being physically active is part of that, but a big piece is connection, even when they don't feel like it. One of my close friends, we were recently talking about how, sometimes he just gets down in these ruts and he doesn't want to get out of bed and he doesn't want to go meet with some of his friends, but he's learned now that the best thing he can do sometimes is just get out and just be seen, to just be face to face with somebody. And he knows the right people, that he knows that are going to lift him up and encourage him. And so, we have to encourage, one, if we're struggling with depression, and that's very likely, by the way. I mean, it's just because we're pastors doesn't mean we're immune to mental struggles and mental illness. But if we're struggling with that, we have to take steps towards health and to be okay with admitting it, being okay with the fact that, hey, I struggle with depression and that's okay. Like, seek help. I would say limit the labeling prior to going and seeing a professional. But if a professional says, hey, yeah, you're struggling with some clinical depression, that's okay. Like, that's not a loss. There's not something you did wrong. It doesn't mean that you have a lack of faith. It just means that you have an organ, and it's called a brain. And that brain is just like any other part of our body. Sometimes it can get sick, and we have to utilize some of these tools that God's allowed us to discover. Like, if our heart was sick, I would say most of us listening to this podcast would have no problem taking some heart medicine, right? Some of us listening to this podcast, our eyes aren't good. And so we go to the eye doctor and we wear glasses or contacts so that we can see better, because sometimes our physical bodies don't function the way that God initially designed them. And in the same way, our brains don't always function exactly the way that God specifically designed them. And sometimes they need some help. And so that's not a bad thing. That is a good thing. And so I would encourage you, if you're struggling with depression or despair, to take some steps towards health.
I like how you related that to other physical or sickness in our body, because you don't will those things to get better, and you don't usually feel bad if something's going wrong there. I mean, you don't like it. You never like it.
Right.
Who wants broken bodies and pain and all that? But I love how you connected the two, because it's the same thing. Like, we can't just choose our way out of either of those types of sicknesses. That's good.
And so, with that being said, whether we're helping a kid or even whether we're trying to help ourselves, connection is a big key. I like to think of it this way. We have to have a connection with our Heavenly Father. Like, that is a necessity towards life. But the second thing that we need, and we all say this as youth pastors, right? And kids pastors, we're like, we need community, get into a small group, right? We know we need connection with each other as well. God designed us that way. And so connection has this ability when it's really intentional and we do specific things that connect on a deeper level, it has the ability to heal and influence the brain towards healing in really predictable ways. So to give you a few of those, since that was your initial question before I went on that rabbit trail.
It was, but before you do that, I'm going to pause you real quick, because we talked about this. As everybody listens to you share these, I think we got to put on a few hats, because one is it's ourselves. If we're wrestling with this, how are the things? Because I know that it's like your friend. You got to do the work sometimes too. It's not just everybody that you're in community with is going to do that for you. You got to step out of the bed. You got to make the call and get together with a friend, right? So we're listening thinking about ourselves. We're listening, thinking about our family, who doesn't know someone, or friends or family. But then there's a lot of people listening to this. In fact, the majority of them are church leaders in some form or fashion, mostly leading kids in student ministry. How can I think the other filter for us that you brought up before we started recording is, how do we help cultivate connection in small groups with kids and students in our church? So how are we going to take what you're about to share and pass that on to leaders, small group leaders, whoever is leading kids and students in our church. So there's like 3 different ways I think we want to listen to the things you're saying. I just want to tee people up before you do it.
Yeah, no,
So
that's
we're
a
ready.
great question. And since I already hit, us a little bit, and I've hit a little bit of, our kids, I think that is a great question. Like, how do we set up our ministries to be ministries of connection? How do we set up our ministries and our leaders specifically? Because we can't do it all, right? Maybe you're naturally, as a pastor, a ministry leader, you're naturally really good at helping people to feel seen and to connect with the heart. But how do we lead our leaders to be able to do that? And recently, I was faced with what parents feel when they drop their kid off at a student event for probably the first time in my life, because, for 15 years, I or someone on my team, so somebody I've been in leadership with, has been hosting a student event of some sort. Well, recently I dropped off my brand new middle schooler to a friend's event at a trampoline park. And I all of a sudden felt what parents feel. Like, I'm used to kind of worrying about and thinking about, 50 kids, 100 kids, right? Every kid there I'm concerned about. I'm concerned with how they're connecting and who's connecting with who. And, are they having a good time? Are they relationally hanging out? Are small group leaders engaging, right? I'm thinking about all those things. But that day, I only cared about one kid, I only cared about that one kid, if he would make new friends. I cared if he felt accepted. I cared that he hopefully laughed until his belly hurt. And most of all, that there would be a caring adult, a significant conversation that would lead him closer to Jesus, right? That was the only thing I cared about. And I couldn't help but feeling a little bit of this tension as a ministry leader, thinking about, man, I really hope my friend has trained up his leaders really well. Maybe that's judgmental, but it's like I couldn't unthink about that. It's like it just was what I felt. I felt this pressure of, I care so much about my kid as a parent, and I really, 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 really hope that this team and these people are caring as much as I care, right? That they're going to see him, they're going to engage in a conversation. And so how do we do that, though? How do we make sure that we are training our teams to cultivate connection? How do we train our volunteers in a way to see every kid in a deeper level? And so the obvious here is consistent training, right? So let me start with that. Like, I know as a youth pastor, kids pastor, it's easy for us to get caught up in the planning and running meetings and ordering, crazy amounts of food for events and whatever the details are. And sometimes, at least this has been my history, is that I can let training my volunteers kind of fall to the wayside, right? And it becomes second priority to everything else. I think over the years, I've learned that I've had to flip that. I've had to get better at training volunteers on a consistent basis and figuring out ways to even kind of push content or resources to them without necessarily always getting them in the room, right? Like, we feel that tension too. It's like we think, oh, I need a leader training. Well, let's get them all into a room. Well, that never happens, but maybe once or twice a year, because nobody ever shows up for our little leader trainings.
Even worse now. It was hard before the pandemic.
Worse.
Yeah, it's even worse now.
So true. So we you have to have some form and system of ongoing training. And I don't want to dive too much into those weeds, because there's a lot of resources out there on creating consistent training, systems and ways to disperse training material. But as you kind of figure out, okay, when it comes to connection and cultivating connection, what are some things that I can train my leaders? And so, shameless plug here. This is where I'll say, the Scene book was written specifically for this, like to be able to empower caring adults to make deep connections. And so there's 5 kind of, tools that we talk about, and I'll just briefly touch on each one of them. The first one is to show up. And this isn't the goal of connection. It's just the starting point. It's kind of like you hit the Bluetooth button on your headphones, and it all of a sudden starts to pair. That's what showing up does. Showing up is the starting point to connection. And I would say, after 2020, there is a greater felt need for us to just simply feel seen, right? And to be face to face. We've learned the value of face to face. And as youth pastors, let me speak to all the youth pastors listening, we've learned that digital youth ministry is not as effective as we maybe hypothesized that it would.
Yep.
I know I did. I thought it would be more effective. I thought it would work. I thought they'd be totally into it, and they weren't. And I think the real reason is because there was a greater value that they wanted and they needed deep in their heart and their soul. They needed to feel seen, and you lose a lot of that in the digital space. So we need to show small group leaders how to show up and to disconnect from their day and to fully be present. You may have heard this phrase before, when a kid's in crisis or when somebody's in crisis, it's the ministry of presence, right? Showing up is the ministry of presence. And it's 50% of the work, really, I think, when it comes to cultivating connection. The second one is to see them and to not just see them on the physical side, but to see beyond the behavior. Don't just take the line, I'm fine at face value, but to kind of see beyond the facade, to look into what are you feeling right now? And even asking like, hey, how do you feel? Helping to cultivate small groups that emphasize a little bit on verbal processing of emotions. Like you mentioned, Nick, that emotional exhale can be very powerful. There's a lot of neuroscience behind that, by the way. And in the book, we kind of break that down a little bit. So the simple way to explain that is the right side of your brain has a lot of your emotional processing, and you have to decrease some of that energy on the right side of the brain so that your left side of your brain, your logical processing, can kind of re-engage. So that's what emotionally exhaling kind of does. This is why therapy is so powerful, by the way, because just simply talking out your emotions is shifting that thought process energy from the right side of your brain to the left side of your brain where your language processing takes place. So it kind of gets the whole brain back working again after it's experienced a high amount of anxiety, despair, or stress. So when we see kids, we help them to feel understood on a deeper level, right? So we want to do that. And then the next one is to just listen. Listening is a big part of small groups. We all know it. We don't want small group leaders who preach and teach. We want small group leaders who really listen and facilitate and create tension in a way that cultivates conversations. And so in Scene, we offer a few listening tools and active listening tools. And, one of my favorite phrases, so I'll give you one of the little nuggets there, is just helping leaders to respond with, tell me more. When a kid opens up and says, it made me feel really mad, tell me more. Period. And then stop talking, just let it be.
And let it be awkward, right? If it needs to be for them to answer.
Yeah,
because they probably don't want to tell you. I mean, they do want to tell you more, but they don't want to tell you more sometimes, right?
Yes. Yeah. Tell me more. Let it be awkward. You're absolutely right. It's okay. And this is where good eye contact, the appropriate physical touch can come in. The active listening, the facial expressions even matter, your tone matters when you're listening. So listening is more than just hearing somebody's words. It really is a full body experience, if you will, in terms of how you're presenting yourself. Even as we're talking on this podcast, I know it's audio, but you and I can see each other and we're watching each other's facial expressions. We're watching the nods and the smiles and the eyebrows raised, right? Like we're watching that, and those active listening skills help us to kind of feel like we're being heard, right? I know I'm feeling that way. I feel like you're tracking with me.
Definitely. It's like, and here's the other thing is kids know that. So obviously by the time they're 8, 10, 15, they know it. I mean, like 3, like they know it.
Yeah.
I can remember our kids at different times, look at me, or you know what I mean? Or in fact, they want you to overwatch, right? Because it's all in that phase of like, watch this, or let me show you this, or whatever. In fact, we were playing in the pool last night, and one of our kids was like, watch, and we're watching. And literally, I think she said the same thing 5 times to make sure we heard it before she showed us the jump in the pool.
Yes.
It's like, we're good. We got
it. We got it.
But so even at a young age, people know when they're not really being listened to, right?
Yeah, that's right. You're absolutely right. And teenagers you're absolutely right. They'll sniff it out quicker than anything. So the fourth one is to speak life. And let me say this, we often will jump to this one right away in the church world because, speaking life and speaking truth and scripture, I mean, this is what we want to get to. But we first have to help kids to feel seen before we can kind of jump to the truth part of it, right? It's the win the heart before you can lead the mind. And so speaking life is powerful because there's all these negative voices and all these negative thoughts that they kids and teenagers are battling constantly. When we speak truth over them and we reaffirm who they are in positive affirmation, we're helping cultivate their identity in very powerful ways. And so part of connection isn't just listening, isn't just emotional exhaling and simply showing up. Part of it is also now, after I've listened, after I've let the emotional exhale happen, now I'm going to speak life. Now I'm going to kind of speak truth over them. Hey, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Hey, let me remind you how special and unique you are. Let me remind you that, man, you said this one time, and I fully believe it, that God's going to use you in that way, whatever it might be, but just to speak life over them. And then the last one is to build grit, which this is the ultimate goal, right? We all want to build up a generation that can actually overcome challenging circumstances. We want them to be able to overcome negative emotions and not be overcome by their emotions to the point where they're in despair and living in despair. We want them to be able to have the strength to stand strong in the midst of adversary and just to keep on moving even when it gets tough. So helping them to build grit is a part of connection as well, because when we as leaders help in an appropriate way, kind of challenge them to press on or to combat negative thoughts and to reframe some things even. I mean, that's all kind of resilience, building grit, forming things. What we do is we empower them and help them to feel like, you know what, I can do this. I can overcome. And, I think Josh Shipp always says, every kid is one caring adult away from success. And that is so true. Like we need one caring adult to get behind a kid when they're struggling with despair, depression, or anxiety and say, hey, I see you and I'm with you. Like, you got this. Let's do this together. I'm walking with you. And when we do that, I think it cultivates ministries of connection in powerful ways. And we know that, right? We know that we've seen small groups who kind of intuitively just get it. Some of our best small group leaders naturally do these things. But this framework, what it does is it helps people who maybe aren't as natural at connection. It helps give them some very practical tools on how they can just connect with the heart of a kid or a teenager.
That's great. I have like 18 thoughts and questions, and we don't even have time to hit all of them. But there were a couple of things I thought about as you were going through there is, yes, I totally agree that we're more apt to the speak life thing because it feels like preaching. I also think, though, you can feel like you're doing that one to many. Like I can preach in a message and try to be encouraged to 60 students at once. As much harder to listen to 60 students. But then that leads me to another thought, right? Which is we can't do it on our own, right? So that's why I think empowering small group leaders to cultivate connection is important, because I can't actively be a great listener to 100 students if that's somebody's in the ministry, right? I need other people to be.
That's right.
To be there. So, and I do love that the book is written with like action steps and questions at the end. Like it's not just a book, it is like a guide too. So I think that I'm thinking about my church and our student ministry and how much it's going to be great to go through this with our leaders. And it's kind of written that way. You also have, real quick, the feelings wheel. I know this is not like an original concept, but like describe that and like how many things are on that. I think it's in maybe the second
Oh my goodness.
point.
That's a great question. I don't know how many feelings are on it. I should count them, but there's a lot.
It might take
there's
you
a lot of feelings. Yeah, it might take you a while. And yeah, the feelings wheel is helpful because we in our culture have lost the ability to verbally kind of identify our emotions, right? We typically stay pretty basic with our emotional identification to I'm mad, sad, angry. Well, that's same as mad, happy, right? We kind of stay to that core root of emotions. What the feelings wheel does is it helps kind of break that out a little bit more and emotionally exhale some of those emotions in a more specific way. And when we do, I mean, this is just research after research after research shows that our brains respond in significant ways and predictable ways, really, where stress begins to decrease. We feel seen, we feel connected with another person. Another hormone called oxytocin kind of starts to jump in, and a few other ones as well, and start to help us to feel connected with and feel safe again. And so, helping teenagers helping teenagers to identify emotions, you can use the feelings wheel as a tool to do that.
Yeah, I pulled it up and I was like, I can't count that. There's no way I can
Yeah,
count
it's a
that.
lot.
It looks like
It's
100
a lot.
or 130.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like it's a lot. But I love that it helps you go from, okay, I feel insecure. And is it weak? Is it not that at all? Maybe it's a different reason. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it goes from like the broad category of sad or angry to something a little more specific to something even more specific. And I do think that helps. I mean, some of the parents that I learn from, one of the things I just love about their parenting that I'm not naturally good at is the ability to kind of connect with their kids that way and help their kids process that. You know, whereas a lot of us grew up in a way where it was like, no, just push that under or whatever, get over it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And as parents, it's easy to go there, right? Like, oh gosh, not this again. You know,
Not this.
Pull it together. But I so appreciate that, and I think that's helpful. Well, I wish we had more time for it. We could certainly have other conversations about it. But I do have one last question, probably a curveball to throw at you, because I'm thinking about how you have talked about this for at least a few years now. The concept has evolved, the tools, have evolved. You've talked about it to multiple sets of parents in different churches. You've spoken in many school gyms, to students.
Yeah.
And so I guess my last question is there anything that stands out from talking to students, talking to different parents, presenting this in different ways? Dr. Chinwé getting involved with this book. And she's just an amazing, brilliant person, right? Who I'm sure has added so much to that. And so in the span of a few years or however long this journey's been, what stands out that you've learned on top of what we just covered?
Man, that's a great question. I mean, so many of these concepts I've learned and have applied them even to my own parenting. And, the book there's a few stories in the book where I even share some of my failures. I would say 4 years ago, 2016, so almost, 5 years ago, I guess.
We just skipped 2020. That's just what we
I know.
do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
That's exactly it.
That didn't happen. Yeah, exactly.
I was using the wrong tools, though. As a pastor, I was missing it, and there's some ways that I responded that I wish I would have responded differently, because I think I would have helped some kids when they were facing depression and despair a little bit more than what I did back then. And so these tools were things that I've learned, that I've applied and seen results both in my ministry world as well as a parent. But I would say, in the last year, one of the things that I've learned is that we need this is going to sound extreme, but we need a revolution of conversations again. That part of why we're here is because we've lost, and especially the next generation has lost the ability to have face-to-face conversations in a way that helps each other to feel seen. I think about decades ago, we went and we spent time with our friends every day after school. And there were these micro events in these circumstances where we felt empathy, we felt loved, we felt understood, we felt seen. And in the digital space, we just don't experience the same kind of things. And our brains know it. Our brains are not always logical, and so it just feels different. And I think that's part of why we are where we are. So we need connection.
Yep. Makes a ton of sense. I remember seeing studies recently about like a number of close friends that adults 30 to 50 would say they had, and it was like 6. I don't even know if it was 6, 4 before the pandemic and 2 after, something like that.
Right.
We're talking about adults. We're talking about 30, 40-year-olds or whatever. Well, tell us where we can get the book, when it's released. I know there's pre-order and all that, but we're about up here on the release. So tell us about all that and how people can connect with you. If they have any questions, if they want to get you to speak to their parents, which they should. That was awesome for parents in my church, so they should absolutely do that. At schools, if you got connection with schools, should be able to do that as well. But tell us about how to get the book.
Yeah, so you can go to thescenebook.com, and that's where you can find all the purchase links everywhere you could buy it. There's a couple different places, Amazon, ParentQ, Orange, and a few other bookstores that you can pick up the Scene book. If you're a ministry leader and you're buying in bulk, buy them from Orange and ParentQ, because there's price breaks that you get. I don't remember where they are, but they're on that website. Yep. And then that's where you can also request information if you'd like Chinwé or I to speak, or to share at your church, to do a webinar for your parents, or even a live event. We'd be happy to do that. you can go to thescenebook.com to request information.
Awesome. Well, I'm so thankful again for this work you've been doing and for the book now that I'm sure will just help it get it into more hands, more leaders, more parents, and just help more kids and students. So thanks, Will, for coming back on the podcast and for writing this book and doing the research and helping us all cultivate connection better.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
I really am excited about the new book scene, that obviously that content and kind of the ideas, the research has been going on for a while. We've talked about it here on the podcast before, but just to see that come to fruition in this book, and so many more leaders and parents and churches are going to be able to use this to help kids and students feel seen. And man, how important this is. I know it's hard to hear some of those stats, just of how much worse mental health has gotten even before the pandemic, but certainly through the pandemic. And it just reemphasizes how important this is, right? And so the action steps I think of coming out of this interview are pretty obvious. Get the book and really get the books, because there's probably parents or leaders that you need to get books for. Go through it with your team, whether it's volunteers, staff, parents, whatever. But then that third step is to make sure you share it with parents. I as a parent want to have the tools and handles and knowledge to navigate conversations with my kids beforehand if I can. You can't with everything, right? Some things you're not going to be ready for. Some things are going to turn up that you just can't be prepared for. But we can with this. And this matters no matter what. Like the principles from this book and how to help cultivate connection. We want to cultivate connection regardless of what's going on in a kid's life, what their mental health status is, how are they feeling at any point, right? We want to cultivate connection all the time. This is just a reminder of how important that is. So get the book, get many of them, share them, use them with your church, with yourself, your family, your leaders. And I think you'll find it to be a really, really helpful tool. I mean, you heard some of the simple ways that I've already applied some of these concepts in my parenting, and I'm really excited to continue that as they get older and these conversations become even more critical. Get the show notes and anything else we talked about, links and all that at nickblevins.com/episode 234. It's thescenebook.com. Definitely go there if you want to bulk order and get more than just one. But other than that, Amazon is a great source there. Thanks for listening. I hope this is helpful. I hope you use it, read the book, implement it in your context. And we'll be back next week with another interview specifically about family ministry, about partnering with parents and a strategy to do that. So I'll catch you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.